All right, we should be recording now. Uh, so, um, yeah, I'm here with Eric Weber. Uh, Eric is a friend of mine, and we've been chatting for a couple of years now, sort of pretty regularly, talking about all sorts of data science topics, from technical topics to more business-related topics. And I'd say pretty recently, we started speaking much more about data science leadership and where data science should be in an organization and sort of management leadership topics that don't typically get a lot of attention in media. And we thought that it would be interesting just to record one of our conversations and sort of host a little bit of a podcast that we could share out with the world at large. We don't really have any goals whatsoever with this, except to just talk as we usually do and share something that might be interesting to a few other people. So I'll just, for those who don't know me, my name is Luigi Patruno. I'm the Vice President of Data Science at a company called 2U, where I lead the data science department. And I've been there for about 5 years. Eric, why don't I pass it over to you to introduce yourself?
Awesome. First, just like excited to do this and record it. And, you know, these conversations are always valuable for me, and I hope they end up being valuable for others too. I am a Senior Director of Data Science at Stitch Fix. I've been at Stitch Fix for about 2 years. I'm primarily responsible for a lot of our horizontal functions, like product data science, experimentation, forecasting, you name it, anything that applies horizontally to the business, I tend to think about. And I think Luigi and I have gotten into a lot of good conversations, primarily because these are like real world problems that we run into on a daily basis, right? And I think the most interesting part is I don't think there is a perfect solution, but like understanding like the affordances and constraints of different approaches is incredibly valuable, and it's something that I think we hope to share. So I'm excited to dive in.
Awesome. So I've never hosted a podcast, Eric. I don't know about you.
I don't think so. I don't really know how to, so we can just, you know, we're going to learn as we go.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't know how to either. So in the spirit of that, and in the spirit of sort of using some of the more innovative data science technology that exists today, I used GPT just to generate a bunch of questions for us, you know, in the general areas that we're interested in. And I think it would be cool if we sort of co-host this conversation by asking one another questions back and forth. So with that, I'll take the first pass, and we have about 10 to 15 questions. I don't think we'll be able to get through them all, but let's just start I'll start at the top. So how would you describe the role of data science at Stitch Fix? And you know, you've started touching on that in your introduction already, but then I'll go after you.
I mean, the role of data science at Stitch Fix has definitely evolved over time. Stitch Fix's differentiator that they're pretty public about is personalized styling. So when you think about personalization, like the role of data and data science, and quite honestly, a lot of like AI work, and I mean real AI work, goes into creating real personalization. So for us, there's data science that focuses on like production systems that actually like are our core differentiators for how we do styling and operations and run the business. We also have, you know, I think what I would call more like measurement and decision data science that complements a lot of that like production system type of work. But in aggregate, like Stitch Fix isn't the business that it is without data science. And it really started with it, which I think makes it unique relative to a lot of other companies. It wasn't just kind of an add-on. It was a like, this is what we're going to build our business around, which makes it really interesting and also honestly hard, because a lot of the things that you would normally assume are in place at a company that has a mature data science function are not in place because we built the company in kind of a different way. So would love to hear from you kind of about your work at 2U and some of the things that you're up to.
Yeah, I think part of why our conversations have always been very interesting is because you're working at an organization where data science is a sort of a core part of the business and how it operates. And on the other hand, I'm coming from a company where that's not the case, right? So at 2U, data science isn't a core part of the product. And it was sort of an add-on function as the company was growing. And instead, how we operate is it's really sort of an optimizer for other business functions. So we work with a lot of internal stakeholder groups, teams like marketing, finance, product, other engineering organizations. And we really go in there and we try to help optimize their operations through some sort of data science related technique or project. So sort of the things that are really our bread and butter, and this really impacts also how we're organized as a team, right?
Yeah.
So we haven't historically been embedded in different teams. We've been a sort of centralized center of excellence where we will go into another team, talk about potential opportunities or challenges, and then come up with projects that we then work on in a very sort of centralized way, almost like a much more of a consulting model, I would say, right? Where a team might hire consultants to build out some projects. They would sort of hire us to build projects for them. I think what is interesting though is, that really impacts the types of projects we work on, who we work with. We want to look for places where the right data is available, that sort of thing, where we can have a big impact. And I think it really, really colors our day-to-day, probably in a lot of ways that we don't think about too often, and probably in some ways that we've never even thought about at all, because we've always been operating in this sort of way. And it's been interesting recently as, 2U acquired edX, which is, a digital platform, sort of a digital first experience, how my team is adapting to the sort of new paradigm which I think might be much more similar to sort of your world, where you started digital first, and you're a very sort of modern technology company.
I think what's fascinating about what you just said is, like, regardless of where you start, eventually, and I think across many companies, like, the need to demonstrate ROI on the work that's happening is front and center right now, right? I think a lot of the macro pressures that have emerged in the last year and a half, 2 years, really put that pressure on, like, what is data science doing for us? So I'm curious for you, like, how do you think about communicating the value and ROI of data science, particularly in a consulting type of model where you have to kind of prove it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's definitely one I've thought about a lot, and has changed a lot over the 5.5, almost 6 years that I've been at 2U. It's interesting. I've actually found that it's much easier to convey value when you're working in a sort of consulting-based model versus when data scientists are embedded in different product teams.
Yeah.
And that could be because I've just been doing the consulting model for much longer, so I have more reps. Or it could be that there's something more there. I'm not sure yet. But to answer that question fully, I could talk a little bit about sort of how we pick projects, or how I help the team pick projects. And that's really one of my main functions, is making sure that we're focused sort of on the right high impact areas. So the way I think about it, and it's really, and I've learned a lot just from studying general business best practices, I would say. I have 2 high-level criteria for what projects that the team works on to help us pick projects. One is that the opportunity needs to have high impact, right? And by high impact, I mean high financial impact. So it could either generate a good amount of revenue, or it can help reduce costs significantly. And the way we understand that typically is through conversations with the stakeholder teams who have the challenge, right? So our primary stakeholders. And there internally we have product managers who report into our team, and one of their responsibilities when scoping new projects is to understand what is the potential impact, right? So sometimes we'll have teams come to us and they have a very real challenge, but at the end of the day, that problem, if solved, will save their department like 20 hours of work, And while that problem is front and center for them, it's just not globally impactful enough for our team to take on. So that's one sort of dimension. It needs to be a high impact area in terms of financial impact. The other sort of axis in our two-dimensional sort of system is what's the likelihood that we'll succeed as a data science team, right? And the likelihood there is not just a technical, it doesn't just incorporate technical factors, although those are important. For instance, like, do the right data sets exist? Is the right infrastructure there? Can we actually, if we're building a predictive model, do we believe with some confidence that we'll actually be able to predict the target well enough? But then there are also organizational factors. So for instance, do we believe that the stakeholder group is committed to using data science techniques and to changing their operations because of something that we build, so that we could actually realize that impact, right? And it's not just commitment, but it's also investment, because those teams will need to spend time, training their staffs differently or changing their processes, and right, and they need to be invested into spending time. This is not just sort of throw something over the fence and then the problem will go away. They really need to be committed with us. So those are sort of the two primary ways that we factor into solving projects. And when we do that, to answer your original question, because this is a little bit of a tangent, at the end of the day, we're able to actually measure, once we change those processes or those operations, whether we actually realize that financial impact that we estimated before we even got the project started. And through that, there we have like an actual impact, and we can normalize it by, how much time we spent working on the project, how many people we had working on the project, and we can have a fairly, calibrated, I would say, ROI measurement. And that right there is speaking in dollar terms, that's the language of business. So when we talk about our projects that way, we can very easily talk about the impact of our work.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to have meaningful trade-off conversations in a way that finance can understand, in a way that departments can then understand why you're prioritizing another group with respect to theirs. I mean, it's transparent and it's concrete, and that type of prioritization system pays off in a big way.
Yeah. How about you? What is your experience with, I don't want to say justify, but demonstrating value for the work your teams take on?
I think it depends on, honestly, like, I think about this broader than just Stitch Fix and more about like what in aggregate have I experienced over like the past 5 to 7 years in particular. There are like a mixture, and this is less about how I would like to do things and more about how I've seen things actually unfold. And I think certainly in like bigger companies, there's a set of things that generally are prioritized at the top, and like anything that's attached to making those things happen is generally going to be supported, right? Whether it's if we're going after a set of things and we're making 2 or 3 big bets as a company, and we have a really concrete understanding of like what that is going to require of the data science team, then those are almost guaranteed investments, right? There's not even we're not locally justifying the expected size of the prize or like the value proposition of that over the years. And so I think company prioritization can account for a lot of that. And so that, honestly, I would guess that typically is about maybe 50% ballpark of allocation of time is, okay, we're going after these big things as a company. This is what it's going to take from our teams. And I think that perhaps is more common in the non-consulting model, where you have a company that is trying to organize around a set of 2 or 3 things, perhaps, and all the teams are supposed to figure out like, what is it going to take from me to make that happen? I think when you get to the other 50%, that's where it gets more interesting. for me, there is almost always some sense of, particularly in organizations where you are carrying some amount of debt of systems, some amount of that 50% is going to be allocated toward making sure that those systems do what they need to do, that their features can be updated for either internal people or potentially external customers. And so let's say that you're at 70%. That is kind of like either the company has prioritized it, you know that you just need to do it to make the business run. The 30% is much more, I think, self-directed in terms of where do we think we need to invest. And I think that's probably where it becomes more common in terms of the framework that you were discussing, where you try to say, like, what is most likely to actually work and how much is that worth to us as a business? I think that answer can look a little bit different depending on, are we talking about an engineering capability or something that is going to just, we're going to go from 0 to 1. We couldn't do it before and we can do it now, and that changes a lot of dynamics. That tends to be a popular justification. But I think there's also like feature development, right? So let's say in a large data science team, you have 100 things you could do, and each of those 100 things are entirely reasonable. Then it becomes about which group are you going to see as most important to support within the organization. And that's where I align with the framework that you mentioned, because there it becomes much more of a consulting-esque type of model. But I do think this is where like the type of company that you're in and the norms that are established by the senior leadership team really do affect like prioritization, trade-offs, and it's just different. And as I see people work across data science leadership, I think we all run into these problems depending on the type of organization that we're in. I find it interesting, hard, frustrating, all of the words, but that's at least been my experience.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I definitely want to zoom in on from that you said. I find super interesting. I love the first part of your answer about sort of hopping on the bandwagon of big priorities that the company has already set, right? And if there are a couple big things, and I think frankly, that would be a large part of any functional team's sort of responsibility, right? There are strategic priorities that the company has set for goals that want to be achieved, and we need to muster all of the resources we can to increase the likelihood that we achieve those goals, right?
Yeah.
And I think another benefit of those sort of large bets at the company level is you have a more global perspective on the resource allocations and like what resources you need, which myself as a data science, somebody who's leading a data science team, I don't often have that global perspective, right? So for instance, when I do those ROI calculations, I can only really measure the dollar value of the data science team's efforts. But I started the call by saying we need investment from our stakeholder teams. So, it's basically impossible for me to factor that in unless I spend a lot of ad hoc time with those teams. And then it's sort of kind of, strange because they're not my teams. So that sort of thing. So, but when you have this global perspective, you can have somebody who's very high level, understanding how much investment is going to be required across the board. So you can make much more sort of global decisions. And actually, I just started reading a book called Working Backwards. And it's sort of written by two former executives at Amazon, and talks about how the company has been able to be so successful and innovative and operationally excellent in all those things. And one of the first parts of that book talks about their annual planning process and how they set large goals across multiple areas. And as parts of those annual plans, the project leaders, and typically there's a single person who's responsible for making sure that the goal gets achieved, and that's something I've seen across the board. That person's team is responsible for listing out all of the resources financial, human capital, technology, and otherwise, that would be required to achieve these goals. And when they do that, sort of, they can have multiple teams incorporated into the work that's required to achieve their strategic goals. So I find that to be like, quite similar to what you described, actually. And based on that, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear more concretely, or maybe like one level of detail down, what does that actually look like in practice for your team, right? Or for your company? When you identify these areas and you make the decision, or you and others make the decision that data scientists needs to be involved in that effort, what does that actually look like? Is there some cadence upon which you make those decisions? And what does that look like once those decisions are made?
I mean, I think there's multiple components to this. And I think the first is that a lot of this happens during like annual planning, where we are trying to align like what does the next year look like. And because that often informs like headcount investment, that often informs like team development plans, like team structure, org structure, all of these things. I think at a high level, we're trying to sketch what we think the year could look like and what it would take to make that successful. And so you're doing that in pretty broad strokes, right? You could estimate it by like how many experiments is a data scientist need to support? Is this person going to be doing analysis? Are they going to be building? And so like the time estimates are always going to be fairly imperfect. But the idea that like we need a person to do this job, right? There's a job to be done and completed, and like we need someone to do it. We try to get pretty concrete and like, what is this thing? What is this person supposed to be accomplishing in the year? I think when it gets to like more execution focused, that happens more on like a quarterly basis, right? Where you're saying, okay, what is this quarter really going to look like in service of this larger thing we expected this person to be responsible for the year? Honestly, I think annual planning, I think for a lot of people is never fully satisfying, because you never quite get down to the detail that you wish you had. But you get to a place where you believe like if we had this type of investment, we could carry out and meet this goal that we've proposed. And that's where it really gets into, we have people who are accountable for a work stream or a project or a goal or whatever layer at which we're defining it for the next year. And that person is accountable for making sure that we've described what investment it's going to take. And then I think you can view quarter over quarter as kind of a opportunity to tweak update our priors, so to speak. If we learn something new and like we can get dramatically changes, but that's generally how the cadence works. And we try to time it so that it happens around the time where finance will be making decisions about like people investment for the next year, because if we need to expand, that would be the time to do it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Totally makes a lot of sense.
Something that I'm curious for you, when I know that you've been doing hiring, and we just talked about like in some cases you decide you need to invest or expand on a particular area in your team, and you've been hiring like layers of leadership in addition to ICs. What are the things that you have prioritized, particularly in the leadership, like data science leadership side of the house? And I know that it looks a little bit different across other companies, but I think it's instructive to talk about like what we've prioritized and looked at.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about like the progression of my team. And when I joined data science, the team was about 3 or 4 people large. We had a sort of a director level, and then we had 3 ICs, and who were purely focused on data science, machine learning, that sort of thing. There was sort of a larger umbrella team that had business intelligence and some data engineers on that team. But if we hold those people to the side and talk strictly about what you and I would really consider data science, there was 3 to 4 people. And in the since that time now, my team is about almost 20 people large, and it is entirely focused on data science. So machine learning, experimentation, and some product to help us with our goals there. And as we started growing larger about 2 or 3 years ago, I was basically the only manager for our team. And at the time, machine learning engineering actually reported into data engineering. So they basically worked only with us, but they weren't reporting into our team. And I had about 5 or 6 data scientists. So the team essentially doubled from when I started, but it was all data scientists. And at that point, we were running few enough projects where I could manage it all, right? I could know enough about each project to be able to steer the ship in the right direction. After that, we moved machine learning engineering to report into me. And then after that, we moved those product managers to report into me as well. And at this point, not only had we substantially grown the team in terms of headcount, but we also started expanding the number of functional areas within the business that we worked on. So one of our primary stakeholders is our performance marketing team. Marketing is a media and marketing is a huge area of investment for 2U. So we always knew that we were going to be working on projects to help make those teams more effective, those marketing teams more effective. But we also started working with a lot of other teams at 2U. So the finance team, some sort of products teams, and then 2U made the edX acquisition. And at that point, I knew right away that how we needed to work was going to substantially change, because we were working on a sort of digital first product, which had a development process that's very similar to other technology companies, right? There's engineering teams, there's product managers who own capabilities, and a centralized data science approach wouldn't work for those teams, right? We really needed data scientists who were working with product managers, engineers, designers in a day-to-day fashion. So basically what I did with the team is we needed to start adopting different operating models. And we had grown to the point where I couldn't manage all the projects anymore. And I certainly couldn't spend my time across our different stakeholder groups and give each the attention they needed. So what I decided to do was start hiring basically, I would say, clones of myself in terms of how they needed to manage a smallish group of data scientists. And each of these sub-teams, these data scientist sub-teams, would be responsible for serving an individual stakeholder group. And the first one I started with was our marketing team. That's because historically a lot of our projects were there. We had a lot of relationships with those teams. And also I had a lot of understanding of the types of projects those teams would need, which helped me shape the job description for the leader of that role much more easily, right? I've never worked for a company that had an embedded data science model. So before I went off and hired that leader, I wanted to have some time sort of in the trenches by myself and understanding what the needs were and getting a better idea of the type of leader we needed to hire there. And frankly, also, we had more time there. Whereas like the marketing function, we had many projects that were already ongoing, so we needed somebody sort of now. Yeah. And like when I looked for a leader there, I honestly looked for two things. One was experience managing data scientists and managing data science projects, ideally in a sort of centralized fashion, and who had experience with the types of models that we would need, and I had good understanding of those models. And the other was somebody who had good experience in marketing specifically. Yeah. So I was actually even willing to hire somebody who came from the marketing world and may not have come from the data science world, but somebody who came from the marketing world and was very technical, obviously, and very analytical and familiar with the types of data science approaches that are used in marketing. So those were the two big things I looked for, right? Like managing technical people, experience managing technical people and technical projects, but also solid working experience and interest in working on marketing related problems. And marketing is a much bigger area than most people understand, myself at the time. For instance, like I had an idea that marketing was only advertising in the past.
Right.
That's not the case at all. Marketing is a much larger sort of umbrella term. It includes pricing. It actually includes product, the types of products that are developed, distribution, all those sorts of things. So I looked for somebody who had that experience, and luckily I was able to find somebody relatively quickly who perfectly fit that profile and came from a technical data science background. Yeah, and now I'm actually looking to hire that other role that I mentioned, right? The leader of the sort of embedded data scientists. Now we're at that stage where that's the type of person I'm looking for, and it's a totally different profile that I'm looking for that role.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you touched on that's quite relevant to anyone who goes into data science leadership is eventually you start to be responsible for areas in which you were not an IC. It's not your area that you grew up in, and it's not the area that you like cool, I written code to solve those problems, and suddenly you're confronted with having to solve organizationally, like, how do I do this for something? Like, I'm not a data engineer, but I manage data engineering. So like, what does that mean? And so finding the right person who often has like grown up in that domain, or at least is familiar enough with it to make decisions and investments and guide a team is really critical. So like scaling yourself becomes really, it's a challenge, and being okay with saying, hey, like, I'm responsible for this, but I'm also not the expert in it, and trying to solve that problem becomes really important. Whereas like the things you're rewarded for before that are like being the expert in something, right? And like solving all the problems, when you have to suddenly say like, oh no, I'm not the expert in this space. I have to figure out how to, but still have to make sure that the team can execute in a productive way. I find that to be one of the most interesting parts about hiring leaders into these spaces.
Yeah, I totally agree. And based on what you said, I had a little bit of a follow-up question. I think this would be interesting for a lot of people. The path into leadership is not at all clear for a lot of professions, but I would say certainly for data science, right? Where individuals who work as data scientists or ML engineers typically come from very technical backgrounds, right? They may have, you yourself have a biostats degree, right? If I'm correct, and pure math, right? Shout out to pure math. I have a pure math background as well. There's not many of us out here, but
we're doing what we can.
We're doing what we can. It's a respectable background if it's yours. But some people come from engineering backgrounds, economics, physics. I worked with chemists, biologists, etc. And we typically don't have the business training, right?
Yeah.
And I've found that sort of getting that business training has been very helpful for myself as I've grown. But I don't have an MBA, and I know you have an MBA. What's your thoughts on somebody who's looking to get into leadership from that technical background in data science, right? What do you think are the important factors for that person to consider, and think, what are the important actions for that person to take in order to prepare for a leadership career?
I mean, I think the important part is like ignoring the adjective data science, and then you'd be like, why do you want to be in leadership at all? Right? Like, leadership it's hard. There's a lot of like, what is your motivation for wanting to be responsible for and lead other people, right? It is, I think we often index really way too highly on the like management component, which is the tactical, like, make sure that the team is working on the right things, make sure that sprints are happening in the right way. Like, but it's much more about like, you're trying to create like a place where people feel a part of something, that they feel like they're working on interesting problems, that they can grow their career. It's a big responsibility. It's a very big responsibility. And it also changes how you need to evaluate, the things that made you very good as an IC don't often translate naturally into being very good in leadership, unless you like have an inclination to want to like maybe you had a great manager or you had a great lead and you want to be like, I want to be able to do something like that for other people. So I think the first question is like, why leadership at all, right? The data science component, I think that's where it starts being like, okay, if you really want to be in leadership and you have the data science chops, then I think it's workable. If you have the data science chops and you're just looking for like, hey, I want to get paid more or I want to do something different, like you're going to burn out pretty quickly because the thing that made you excited about the role before, you're going to be in a totally different role. Like the pressures on you, the like, what does success look like, suddenly become different. And like solving problems is no longer just about like hands-on keyboard, right? You have people problems, you have organizational problems. And so I think you really have to answer those questions for yourself. And in terms of like how it happens, I think there's so many different ways, right? It's like the most common thing is that it happens in the organization that you're in, right? That there's a change and there's a need for a manager or a leader, and you end up being the right person through whatever process, like however that's determined. That can be a great way to step into it. I think some people view it as like, I have to go make this jump at a different company, which happens, but it's much more common to see people make that change internally and get that experience. And sometimes it's really hard to know when that moment is going to come, right? They like, you can be there for years and be like, well, that's probably never going to happen. And then suddenly 3 people above you leave. Suddenly there's a vacuum and a need for people to step into it. And so I think it is really about having that, like, are you interested in leadership conversation before the opportunity ever presents itself? Because I think sometimes when that does come up, it can be fast and furious, and that can be overwhelming.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think you have a great perspective on that. Something that I remember hearing, and I still hear today, but I remember hearing when I was an individual contributor, and I don't think it quite registered, but now it totally, I totally understand it, is that, you know, being a data scientist and being a manager of data scientists are 2 totally different jobs, right? Yep. I think when I was less experienced, I almost saw the, you know, data scientist or any individual contributor to manager of those individual contributors as sort of the natural progression.
Yeah.
And I think historically that might have been the case if you wanted career progression, but that's no longer the case today in technical disciplines like data science or software engineering, where you could be at a company that has a very, very experienced decades long experience as an individual contributor, and that person is very highly valued for their technical chops and their ability to make sort of architectural decisions and that sort of thing. But at the time, you know, I definitely saw it as, you know, this is the next step in the data scientist career. And I think I know I have that inclination to want to lead. And it just sort of worked out for me. Although it came with a lot of growing pains that I didn't fully prepare for, I would say. But I was able to take them sort of in stride, and I'm invested in my growth. So I tried to take those challenging moments and turn them into growth opportunities. But certainly if I wasn't inclined or desiring of being a leader, I, would have had a very, very hard time and potentially have just gone back to being an individual contributor, not because I wasn't quote unquote good enough or because one was better than the other, but because contextually it wouldn't have been the right thing for me.
Yeah.
Right? And I think what you're saying is do that work up front to understand whether or not you actually want to do it. Now, I think I would add one thing as a sort of tactical thing that you can do to help you answer that question. And it's often something that doesn't get done, I find, but it's something that everybody should do. And it's go find people who are in the positions you want to be in and talk to them, right? I think today it's easier than ever to message somebody on LinkedIn or Twitter and say, hey, I want to, I respect you, and I really see myself in the sort of position that you're in today. Would you be willing to chat for 20 minutes or answer my questions over email about like what your day-to-day is like? Yeah. And I know, that's how you and I started talking.
Yeah, it
right.
is.
And now we've been talking for like 2 to 3 years. It's actually
Yeah.
pretty crazy.
Remarkable.
Yeah, and you know, that's like, I think you can learn a lot. You know, you want to get that sort of firsthand experience as a manager, but the next best thing is living vicariously through others.
It is. Cool. I think we're at about the time where maybe we call this part 1. I think we have a lot more that we can talk about once I'm back in October, but let's stop the recording.
Okay, sounds good.
I feel like that was a good set of topics for